For years, Bishop John Gray stood in pulpits across America preaching hope, power, and grace. But behind the microphone, he was fighting a darkness few ever saw. At 50, he's finally breaking his silence. 5 nights. 5 moments that nearly destroyed his faith, his marriage, and his ministry. What happened in those rooms left him in tears, alone, questioning everything he ever preached. And tonight, for the first time, he's revealing what really happened and why those nights still haunt him. It's easy to see the bright lights, the packed churches, and the millions of followers online and think success came without scars. But what most people don't realize is that behind Bishop John Gray's laughter and energy was a man silently battling guilt, pressure, and public humiliation. For years, rumors swirled, stories leaked, whispers about mistakes, temptations, and breakdowns spread across social media. But through it all, Bishop Gray stayed mostly silent until now. In this powerful and deeply personal revelation, Bishop Gray opens up about the 5 nights that changed everything. Nights of regret, isolation, and tears that no one saw but God. Nights where his ministry felt like a burden, his faith wavered, and the man who preached hope began to question his own. You won't believe what he confessed about those moments, and how they led to the most humbling chapter of his life. Because when fame collides with faith and the world watches you fall, the climb back up becomes more than a sermon. It becomes survival. And as we uncover each night, one by one, you'll see a side of Bishop John Gray that no camera ever captured. But the first night, that's where it all began. It was a Sunday evening, the kind that should have felt victorious. The lights were bright, the congregation was on its feet, and Bishop John Gray had just delivered one of his most powerful sermons. The crowd roared, cameras flashed, and his name echoed across the church. But when the applause faded and the church doors locked behind him, the silence hit harder than he expected. He sat in the back office, still wearing his suit, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The same man who just told thousands that God can heal what's hidden now felt completely unhealed himself. That night he admitted something he'd buried for years. He was exhausted. Not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally drained. The weight of expectation had become unbearable. Everyone wanted the strong, charismatic Bishop John Gray. But no one asked about the man behind him. The one who hadn't slept properly in weeks. The one struggling to pray. The one quietly terrified that his private weaknesses would one day destroy his public image. And that fear wasn't unfounded. Behind the scenes, cracks were already forming. In his ministry, his marriage, and his mind. Success had become a mask, and the applause had turned into noise that drowned out his pain. As he sat in that empty room, tears welled up. He whispered a prayer, not the confident kind he preached about, but a desperate one. God, I can't do this anymore. For the first time, he felt like his gift was becoming his curse. That was the first night Bishop John Gray cried alone. But it was only the beginning, because what came next would push him further into a storm he never saw coming. Every story of downfall begins quietly, not with a headline, but with a whisper. For Bishop John Gray, that whisper became a storm that refused to die down. By the time he reached his late 40s, he was already one of the most recognizable pastors in America. His charm, humor, and storytelling had made him a household name in both church and entertainment circles. But beneath the laughter, something dark was growing, a series of mistakes that he thought he had buried deep enough never to resurface. That illusion shattered one night when his phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Message after message, missed calls, screenshots, DM. S. It was the night the past caught up to him, and it came not with warning, but with exposure. Someone had leaked private conversations, personal exchanges that painted a picture far different from the polished image the world had known. In that moment, every sermon, every public appearance, every smile suddenly felt like a lie. He sat in his living room that night, his wife Aventur across from him in silence. The air was thick with anger, confusion, and heartbreak. The man who had comforted thousands now struggled to find words to comfort the one person who mattered most. "I don't even know who you are right now," she said quietly, her voice breaking. And for once, neither did he. Bishop Gray had always preached that grace was enough, that God could redeem even the most broken souls. But that night, grace felt distant. His faith felt hollow. The shame was overwhelming, not just for what he had done, but for how it would affect everyone connected to him. His family, He didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in the dark, scrolling through comments, seeing people who once praised him now tearing him apart. Words like fraud, fake, and fallen filled his feed, and yet the one that hurt the most was hypocrite. That was the night he broke down completely one night, not in front of a camera, not on a stage, but in the quiet of his own home. He realized that the same voice that once drew people to God had now become the voice people used against him. Still, in the midst of that storm, something unexpected happened. Aventer didn't leave. She didn't run. She wept, she prayed, and she stayed. But her staying wasn't silent. It came with hard conversations, deep wounds, and a painful road toward forgiveness that was far from guaranteed. That night, Bishop Gray began to see the difference between reputation and redemption. Reputation is what people think of you. Redemption is what God still sees in you. But at that moment, all he could see was ruin. And yet, that was only the second night, because what came after wasn't just emotional, it was physical, a test that would push him to the edge of life itself. There are moments in life when the noise finally stops, when fame, controversy, and pressure all fade into the background, and what's left is just you, your heartbeat, and the sound of a hospital monitor. For Bishop John Gray, that moment came sooner than he ever expected. It was late, somewhere past midnight, when the pain started. Not the kind that a sermon could fix or a prayer could instantly heal. This was the kind that made him clutch his chest and wonder if God was trying to get his attention the only way he knew how. He was rushed to the hospital, struggling to breathe. The diagnosis was terrifying as a saddle pulmonary embolism, a rare and potentially fatal condition. Doctors told him bluntly that people don't usually survive what he was experiencing. His lungs were failing, his heart was under strain, and his body was shutting down. And in that moment, everything he'd ever done flashed before him. The fame, the sermons, the laughter, the mistakes, the tears. He thought about Aventer, about his children, about all the people he'd disappointed. He remembered every time he'd stood in front of a crowd telling others that God would come through. And now, lying there, he wasn't sure if he believed it for himself. In that sterile hospital room, Bishop John Gray broke. He cried harder than he ever had before. Not out of fear of dying, but out of the realization that his soul had been slowly dying long before his body did. The pressure to be perfect, the shame of his past, the burden of reputation, it had all been eating him alive. As the nurses moved around him, as machines beeped steadily beside his bed, he whispered again. The same prayer he had said months before. God, I can't do this anymore. Only this time, it wasn't a plea for escape. It was surrender. He later said that in those moments when he couldn't move or breathe, he heard something. Not audibly, but deep inside. A voice that said, I'm not done with you yet. It was as if God was reminding him that grace doesn't just show up when we're clean. It shows up when we're broken, when the world turns away and only heaven is watching. When he finally woke up after the critical night, the doctors called it a miracle. His family called it a second chance. But Bishop Gray called it a wake-up call, because he knew that if he had survived that night, it wasn't just to keep preaching, it was to start living honestly. Still, survival came with a price. His health was fragile, his reputation still scarred, and his ministry uncertain. There were still people online waiting for him to fail again. There were still headlines and gossip blogs spinning stories about his downfall. But for the first time, he didn't fight it. He started facing the truth. And that's when the fourth night came. The night he faced the people he hurt the most. The night he had to look in their eyes and confront the consequences of his past. After the hospital, the world expected a new Bishop John Gray. One healed, one humble, one grateful. But the truth was more complicated. Survival had given him another chance at life, yes. But it didn't erase the damage that had already been done. The hardest part wasn't the physical pain. It was the mirror. Not the one in his bathroom, but the mirror of his past. The people he had hurt. The trust he had broken. The image he had shattered. It was a quiet evening at home when he decided to face it. Aventer sat across the living room, the same room that had once echoed with laughter and family dinners. Now it carried a different energy, one of unspoken pain and a fragile kind of peace. He told her he wanted to talk, not defend, not explain, just confess. What followed wasn't a loud argument or dramatic scene. It was worse, silence mixed with truth. He spoke about his failures as a husband, his pride as a leader, and the hidden emptiness that drove him to make choices that almost cost him everything. Every word felt like removing a layer of armor he'd worn for years, and every tear that fell felt like a small piece of his old self breaking away. Aventer listened. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she looked away, and sometimes she said nothing at all. But her silence wasn't cold. It was the sound of someone processing years of disappointment and love at the same time. When he finally stopped talking, the room stayed still, and then she said something that he said he would never forget. "John, I forgave you the night it happened, but I'm still healing from the part of me that believed you'd never hurt us." That sentence hit him harder than any public criticism. Because it wasn't anger, it was heartbreak. It was a reminder that forgiveness and healing are not the same thing. Forgiveness is given, but healing takes time. Later that night, after she went to bed, Bishop Gray walked into his home office and sat in the dark again. He looked at pictures of his family, old videos of his sermons, and moments from his career that once made him proud. Now they only made him reflect. He realized that the man he had become was not the man God had called him to be. He had been chasing validation, attention, and applause. And in the process, he'd neglected the very things that made him human. That night, he picked up his phone and called a few close friends and mentors, people who had distanced themselves when his scandals broke. He apologized to each one. Some accepted immediately, others hesitated, but every call was a step towards something real. He also wrote a note to his congregation, but he didn't post it online. It wasn't for likes or sympathy, it was his truth. In it, he admitted that he had failed, not just as a pastor, but as a man. That he had preached strength while living in weakness. That he had let his gift become his God. By the time he finished, the sun was rising. He watched the light pour through the blinds and realized something. The dawn doesn't erase the night, but it proves that the night doesn't last forever. That was the fourth night Bishop John Gray cried alone. Not out of shame this time, but out of release. He wasn't the man he used to be, but he wasn't yet the man he wanted to become. It had been months since that conversation in the living room. Months since the hospital. Months since the headlines. But for Bishop John Gray, healing wasn't about time. It was about truth. He had spent years running from it, hiding behind charisma, using humor as a mask and sermons as a shield. But now, standing in the mirror before stepping on stage again, he knew this time would be different. This time, he wasn't walking up as Bishop John Gray, celebrity preacher. He was walking up as a broken man who had been given one more chance to tell the truth. The church was packed. Cameras were rolling. People whispered as he entered, unsure of what to expect. Some came ready to forgive. Others came ready to judge. But everyone came curious. As he took the pulpit, the room went silent. He didn't start with scripture or a song. He started with a confession. "I don't deserve to be standing here," he said quietly. "Not because I've lost faith, but because I finally understand what faith really costs." The crowd stayed still. Avanter sat in the front row, tears already streaming. He spoke about the nights of shame, the nights of failure, the nights of loneliness. He spoke about crying on hotel floors, battling thoughts he never thought a preacher could have, and feeling like a fraud while still trying to lead others. He didn't hide the pain. He didn't sugarcoat the truth. He admitted that he had failed his wife, his family, his church, and himself. But he also testified that grace, real grace, had met him in his lowest place. He said, "You don't know how powerful God's love is until you've been certain He's done with you." And then He shows up again. The congregation stayed quiet for a moment. Then slowly people began to stand. One by one, hands rose. Tears fell. It wasn't applause this time, it was collective release. A moment where broken people saw themselves in a broken man who finally told the truth. That was the night Bishop John Gray cried again. But not out of shame, not out of regret. He cried because, for the first time in years, he felt free. After service, people didn't rush for selfies or handshakes. They walked up quietly, thanking him for being human, for being honest, for being real. For once, transparency was more powerful than any sermon he'd ever preached. Later that night, at home, he sat on the porch beside Avanter. The air was still. She reached over, took his hand, and whispered, "Now I see the man God was trying to show me all along." He didn't respond, just nodded, tears in his eyes, grateful that love and grace had found their way back home. That was the fifth and final night, the night of redemption.